Welcome to this Autodesk Fusion e-learning module focused on rendering modes. In this video, we will work on rendering this Lego assembly placed on a wooden table. Our goal is to achieve a realistic render, and realism already implies some prior work in design, because when applying lights to an object, if the object is too flat and lacks curves, the lights will impact poorly and give an impression of flatness or lack of volume. To avoid this, I've applied fillets and chamfers to all my objects. This way, the light can interact properly and give a more pronounced sense of realism. I've also prepared another element, which is some cubes that could later serve as spotlights if my global lighting isn't sufficient at the moment. I will hide these spotlights and switch to the rendering mode where we will work on materials, lights, and the environment. We'll start with materials, and for that you can go to your toolbar, click on Appearance, which will open Fusion's material library. The materials under Appearance, not physical materials. Here in Fusion Appearance, you will find a library provided by Fusion with a wide range of materials. For example, if I click on plastic, I will find ABS, acetate, PEEK, or polyamide. For each type of material, you will have several options. Here, I've already prepared the scene a bit to minimize your workload, meaning you already have some plastic materials set up. However, the colors here, orange and gray, are not plastics. For now, one is an enameled paint and the other is steel. So I will create the appropriate materials for these objects. I need a plastic material with some roughness and also reflection. For this, I'll go down in my plastic menu. I'll even go to the translucency menu and select a glossy plastic. Be careful not to choose a matte plastic. I'll choose a glossy plastic and drag it into my design materials. At this point, I can modify this material by right-clicking on it and selecting Edit, or by double-clicking. First, we'll focus on making the plastic material as desired, which isn't a very complex material with simple settings. For more complex settings, you can click on Advanced. I'll show that with another material. In the simplified settings, here for plastic, you will find color, roughness, reflection, and translucency. I will start by adjusting the color by changing the RGB values. For my orange, I need a value of 217, 115, and 19. In addition to color, I need to adjust the properties of my material, such as the level of reflection and roughness, knowing that higher reflection and lower roughness give a shiny material, while higher roughness and lower reflection give a matte material. Here, I want a material that is shiny, but with a reflection that is not completely sharp, so I'll set the roughness to about 0.2 to diffuse my reflection. For reflection, I'm close to the value I want because I don't want too high an intensity to avoid excessive shininess. I'll keep the reflection around 0.5. I don't need my material to let light through, so in terms of depth and translucency, I'll reduce it or even set it to 0. And then I can finalize it. At this point, I have created a material that I can apply by holding the left click and dragging it into an object. However, since I have multiple objects to replace, I can also go to my old material, right-click, select the objects with this material, and then drag my new material into the selection to modify them. I need to do the same for the light gray here, which is currently steel. It's the same material but with a different color. So I can start from the material I just created, right-click, duplicate, and then adjust the RGB values to get a light gray of 89, 89, 89. Here, there is no need to change reflection and roughness since they're already set. I can then reapply all this to the selection. So I select objects and then apply. I take my plastic and drag it into my objects. Here, it tells me that there is already a material applied. It asks if I want to keep it or remove it. In this case, I will remove it. I ignore this warning. It says I am changing the physical material and it can't handle it. But actually, it handles it very well. As you can see, my materials have much less reflection and have probably taken on a gray color. However, I noticed that there is a bar that should be black, which was also modified along with the rest of the selection. No worries, I can take my black plastic and drag it into it. I then worked on my table with the slightly more complex material. I used wood, specifically oak, and even selected a semi-gloss look. I applied to my design and then to my objects. However, it resulted in wood that appeared too white and poorly oriented. So, I went into the settings where I found roughness, reflection, but also rotation and scaling of my texture. In this case, it was poorly oriented, so I set an angle of 90 degrees. If my grain is too large, I can reduce the size of my texture. I could settle for around 45 and get a decent material. However, I went further because this material didn't quite suit me. So I used the general material but changed the textures inside by clicking here on the Advanced button. I can then replace the images for color, roughness, and bump with images I found online or created myself. Here I found an equivalent of oak, but with more vein. So I can go into my resources and replace the current texture with a darker one. However, when changing a texture, make sure to also change the other textures to maintain consistency. I did this for roughness and for relief. I didn't just apply that. I also adjusted the application scale and possibly the depth. To avoid doing it again, I saved this material by right-clicking in my appearances. So when I go to my appearances and into wood, I can find my old oak semi-gloss material already set up and I can easily apply it to my object. However, it appears oriented at 90 degrees, so I will still go into my settings and set it to 90. Similarly, if I want to add spotlights to my two cubes, I applied a standard plastic material in which, under Advanced settings, I activated emissivity and set a luminance intensity of 2000 candles. Thus, I create self-illuminating materials that will serve as spotlights. I added these lights because with my ambience settings, the front was a little too dark. This allowed me to brighten my scene. With my materials set up, I can close and go into the scene settings to adjust lighting and environments. So I click on this button, and the first thing you'll do is go to the Environment tab to change the lighting. Or rather, the HDRI image that generates a light. We already have several options available, but you can scroll down the list to apply an HDRI that you might have downloaded from the internet or created yourself. I chose a desk environment derivative, and I will click Open. You'll see that my brightness will change. Once the HDRI is applied, I'll go back into my settings to adjust its intensity, which I set to 2300 lux, and possibly its position, which adjusts what is visible behind, so our environment, as well as shadows. If I move, shadows moves as well. For this, I set it around 26.2. But at that point, I noticed that I hadn't yet adjusted my camera position. So I'm going to temporarily close this window. When you want to create cameras, you should first position yourself in the view you want, which will be roughly like this. Don't hesitate to zoom in a bit more than needed, because depending on your final resolution, the object could end up looking a bit small in the center of your render. I'll show you that later. If you want to save this camera view, go to your browser, right-click on Name the View, and create a new view, which I'll call my camera view. This will allow me to return to this position even if I have to move to adjust my materials or lights. Now I'll go back to my scene settings. I've set my environment, intensity, and orientation. Initially, you might not see your environment in the background and just see a smooth color, because in the background settings, you need to select environment to use the environment image you've chosen. Now, I need to adjust my focal length, which I set around 8.2. I might even lower it a bit more if needed. I can also tweak the exposure if I find there's too much light or global exposure. In this case, 9.5 works well for my settings. I could also add depth of field, which creates a focal blur that adjusts to the point you place by clicking on one of your objects. You also need to reduce the blur intensity to avoid too much blur. If you're unsure how these settings will turn out, you can check your work by using the Canvas and Render option. This allows you to have a progressive render in your working window, so you don't have to wait until the end to see the result. And it's also interactive. This means that if I move my camera, change a material, or adjust my lighting, the render will update. Here, I can see that my lighting is pretty good. There might be a bit of light missing at the front, so I'll activate my front lights. Visible depth of field and close. My render is ready. I can then go into the render menu and start my render. Here, I noticed that I don't have access to my render, which is normal because I'm working on an older version, not the final one. To start my render, I'll save this version as the latest version, and at that point, I won't have the issue of being on an earlier version. Then I can go to the render button and start the final render. In the render settings, I'll adjust the resolution and choose whether I want to render using the Autodesk computers or my own, meaning in the cloud or locally. I can even choose to have a solid background or a transparent background. For this, I'll go to the Custom section. Then I can choose my resolution. I'll select a video resolution, which gives me a 16.9 aspect ratio that I can lock if I need to increase the values. I'll choose whether I'm rendering in the cloud or locally. In the cloud, we have standard or final quality. Locally, we also have standard or final quality. And if needed, there's even a button, advanced setting, to go for excellent quality. In this case, I'll stay in the cloud, set it to final, and click on render. The render I sent can be seen in the rendering gallery below by clicking on the plus sign, showing that it has started. I can also review my previous renders, and by hovering over the thumbnail, I can see how many minutes remain. It says there are only a few seconds left, but it will take about another minute or two to finish the render. Be careful with your camera framing if you're too close. You might end up with a render where the object is quite small in the center. That's why I zoomed in a bit more. Even now, I think we might still be a bit too far. We'll see in a few moments, as it will take another minute or so to complete. Once my render is finished, I can click on it to enlarge it. If you render it in the cloud, you have additional options like starting a turntable, which is a 360-degree view of your object. You can also enter the post-processing settings to adjust exposure, light, and color values, or add a brightness blur before even opening the file in a post-processing software like Adobe Photoshop. Once you've applied your settings, all that's left is to download your render.